Hi. All right. All right, we're good to go here. So we have some notes in the back. If you didn't get them yet, there's some handouts back there for you. There's prayer sheets back there as well. So make sure you've got those. And we are on lesson 10 of our series, Lessons from Legends. And so tonight we're going to be looking at the example of Esther, found in the book of Esther, and Esther chapter 4. So Esther chapter 4, verse 13, it's right there in your notes. And then if you don't have a set, like I said, they're in the back. And grab a prayer sheet while you're there too, if you haven't got one yet. Esther 4, verse 13 says, Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed, and who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther bade them return to Mordecai this answer. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. Well, through the maliciousness and the conspiracy and the jealousies of a wicked man by the name of Haman, God's people found themselves in a great deal of trouble. But God in his providence had placed a special young lady in a very key position, and that woman, Queen Esther, courageously trusted the Lord and interceded for her people, and God worked a great miracle of deliverance through her. Mordecai says, for such a time as this. You know, God has a vital place and a special task prepared for each and every individual. We don't know why, all the reasons why God has put us where we are. But if you read the Bible, you can be assured that God has a reason for where you are and where he's put you, and he wants to use you there. And so our responsibility, just like Esther, is to be submissive to God so that he can use us like he wants to use us. She was faithful to do that. And so tonight we're going to look at the danger that God's people and Esther herself were facing. We're going to examine and appreciate the faith and the courage that Esther showed and the action she took. And then hopefully we'll choose ourselves to be faithful, to determine to be faithful in our own lives to the Lord. Again, in Esther 4, verse 13, it says, Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed, and who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther bade them return to Mordecai this answer, Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. You know, the Bible tells us, and you can find it all throughout Scripture, faithfulness isn't just something that prophets and preachers are expected to exemplify. Faithfulness is something God has called us all to exemplify. And Esther is a great example of someone who was just a normal, everyday gal and showed herself to be faithful in the most difficult of circumstances. She faced the situation she was put in with faith, and God used her in those situations. And we might encounter some difficult things as well, but if we look at Esther's life and we examine her example, we can find some good encouragement and some helpful principles. So first of all tonight, think about the tough times that Esther found herself in. Tough times. I don't know if there's anyone here tonight that's old enough to remember the Great Depression, but you've probably heard your parents or grandparents talk about it. For many years, it seemed as though conditions in the U.S. kept getting worse and worse each month. There's a passage in the World Book Encyclopedia all about it. It says from 1930 to 1933, prices of industrial stocks fell about 80%. Banks and individuals with investments in the stock market lost large sums. Banks had also loaned money to many people who could not repay it. The deepening depression forced large numbers of people to withdraw their savings. Banks had great difficulty meeting the withdrawals, which came at a time when banks were unable to collect on many loans. Between January 1930 and March 1933, about 9,000 banks failed. The bank failures wiped out the savings of millions of people. In 1925, before the Great Depression, about 3% of the nation's workers were unemployed. The unemployment rate reached 9% in 1930 and about 25%, or about 13 million persons in 1933. Many people who kept or found jobs had to take salary cuts. In 1932, wage cuts averaged about 18%. Many people, including college graduates, felt lucky enough to find any job. In 1932, the New York City Police Department estimated that 7,000 persons over the age of 17 shined shoes for a living. A popular song in the 1930s called "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" expressed the nationwide despair. Human suffering became a reality for millions of Americans as the Depression continued. Many died of disease resulting from malnutrition. Thousands lost their homes because they could not pay their mortgages. In 1932, at least 25,000 families and more than 200,000 young people wandered through the country seeking food, clothing, shelter, and a job. Many youths traveled in freight trains and lived near train yards in camps called hobo jungles. The homeless, jobless travelers obtained food from welfare agencies or religious missions in towns along the way. Most of their meals consisted of soup, beans, or stew and had little nourishment. The travelers begged for food or stole it if they could not get something to eat any other way. Sometimes they ate scraps of food from garbage cans. Many people who lost their home remained in the community. Some crowded into a home of a relative. Others moved to a shabby section of town and built shacks from flattened tin cans and old crates. Groups of these shacks were called Hoovervilles, a name that reflected the people's anger and disappointment at President Hoover's failure to end the Depression. Peggy Terry grew up in Oklahoma during the Depression and recalled a visit to Hooverville in Oklahoma City. Here were all these people living in old, rusted-out car bodies. One family was living in a piano box. This wasn't just a little section. This was maybe 10 miles wide and 10 miles long. People living in whatever they could scrap together. Severe droughts and dust storms hit parts of the Midwest and Southwest during the 1930s. The afflicted region became known as the Dust Bowl, and thousands of farm families there were wiped out. Many farmers went to the fertile agricultural areas of California looking for work. Most who found jobs had to work as fruit or vegetable pickers for extremely low wages, and the migrant families crowded into shacks near the fields or camped outdoors. The famous novel, The Grapes of Wrath, describes the hardships some migrant families faced during the Depression. Tough times. One of the things that Esther faced was an uncertain future. An uncertain future. So in Esther 3:8, we find the scheme hatched here. It says, Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws, therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that had the charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasuries. So not only did Haman hatch this plan, but he funded it as well. King, there's a people that, I don't really like very much, and they're not doing you any good, so I want you to let us destroy them, and I'll pay for it. Don't worry, I'll pay the salary of the soldiers, and I'll take care of that. Life doesn't always go as planned. You've probably heard the best laid plans of mice and men. Well, it's finished. The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. It's part of a poem by Robert Burns. And this might be the case in Esther's life. All of her plans were going haywire. Nothing was happening according to what she thought her life would be like. But the same thing would happen to Haman as well. All of his plans ended up falling apart in the end, and it just shows the sovereignty of God. All throughout history, Satan has tried to attack and harm God's people. We find here in the book of Esther that the whole of the Jewish people there in the kingdom were being threatened with their very lives on the line. But Esther didn't flee. She became the vessel that God would use. She had an uncertain future. There was literally a decree out that all of her family, all of her people would be killed. Not only did she have this uncertain future, she had an unapproachable king. An unapproachable king. She explains it in verse 11 here. She says, all the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the king into the inner court who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. You could only be given audience by the king if you had an appointment. If you walked through those doors, you walked into the throne room of the king without an appointment, and he did not extend his scepter to you, it was instantaneous death. Punishable by death. That's a pretty unapproachable king. That's a pretty big gamble to take, to just walk through those doors and hope and pray that he extends the scepter. But what we have to remember, just like Esther had to remember, God's bigger than any king, president, prime minister. It doesn't matter. A great old preacher by the name of Harold Sightler was known to say, if God is in it, it will work. And in Esther's story, although I'm sure you've heard this taught many times, God doesn't appear by name anywhere in the book. In Esther's story, her older cousin and guardian Mordecai was confident that God would use her to preserve his people. And even if Esther didn't step up to the challenge, that somehow, some way, God would still deliver the Jews, but we'll be dead, was basically what Mordecai was saying. Esther, if you don't do this, God will still deliver his people, but we're toast, And so Mordecai was confident that the Lord would deliver them somehow, some way. And while the world thought the king was unapproachable, she was being told by Mordecai, her mentor, her spiritual advisor, that she needed to take that chance. God is looking for people who will attempt things for him that the world says are impossible. She had an unapproachable king. She had an uncertain future. She was in tough times. But we see she also had some tender traits. It's always good and a blessing and encouraging to come across somebody who cares enough to make a difference, to do something. And Esther cared for her people. She cared about her family. She cared about Mordecai. She cared about the Jews. And she cared so much that she couldn't help but take action. She did something. The Battle of Fredericksburg, Virginia, during the Civil War was basically a one-sided slaughter. The Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by General Robert E. Lee, had made their stand just west of the river at Fredericksburg with a strong position behind a stone wall and upon Mary's Heights behind the wall. As many as 13 separate Union attacks have been hurled against that wall and on that hill, and every time they were pushed back with heavy casualties. All night, thousands of wounded and helpless men lay on the open field, moaning and begging for any kind of help or relief. A Confederate soldier by the name of Sergeant Richard Kirkland of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers went to his commanding officer and asked for permission to carry water to the suffering enemy soldiers. General Kershaw feared that Kirkland would be killed, but also trusted that God would honor and protect such a noble deed. So with that permission, Kirkland gathered all the canteens he could carry, climbed over the wall onto the battlefield, and for well over an hour ministered to his suffering foes as both armies watched in amazement and admiration. Not a single shot was fired, and when he had done all that he could, he returned to his post and took his place in the line. Today, a statue depicting Kirkland's compassion stands near the battlefield's visitor center, and the fighting men on both sides of the line called him the Angel of Mary's Heights. He just couldn't stand doing nothing. He had to do something. And Esther had to do something. She cared enough to do something. The first thing, she cared enough to speak. She cared enough to speak. Mordecai explains it to her in verse 14 of chapter 4. He says, "If thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Mordecai says, if you hold your tongue, if you don't speak, people are going to die. And so in chapter 8, verse 3, Esther spake yet again before the king and fell down at his feet and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Yeah, it's been said many times that silence is golden, but it's also true that sometimes silence is cowardice. Mordecai tells Esther, you can't keep silent. You can't hold your peace. You have to speak up. He challenged her with the thought that God had placed her in the place that she was for such a time as this. And she did care enough to speak. She did bring this matter to the king and risk her life. She also cared enough to fast and pray. It says in Esther 4, verse 16, "Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink these days, night or day. I also, my maidens, will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish." Esther knew it was up to her to speak up for her people. She also knew that in doing so, she would be risking certain death, and she needed spiritual preparation to be made first. She begged the people to pray for her, to fast and pray for her. She said that she would fast and pray herself, and all of her maidens would fast and pray with her. God's word says that certain things only come about by prayer and fasting. Mark 9 says, in verse 25, Mark 9 says, "When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the foul spirit, saying unto him, Thou dumb and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him, and enter no more into him. And the spirit cried and rent him sore, and came out of him, and he was as one dead, insomuch that many said, He is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he was come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, Why could not we cast him out? And he said unto them, This kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting." Certain things require prayer and fasting. There are some spiritual challenges that take special preparations. And Esther, along with her maidens, along with the Jewish people, fasted and prayed for 3 days. Now, this is a great challenge to us. Would we be willing to fast and pray for 3 days if it meant the salvation of a group of people? If we could save so many. She was in tough times, uncertain future, an unapproachable king. She had tender traits. She cared enough to speak up. She cared enough to fast and pray and prepare herself spiritually. And she also has a triumphant testimony. Pretty exciting when God works. In this case, it's evident that God's sovereignty turned the heart of the king. Haman was trying to destroy God's people. Ultimately, it was he that was destroyed. When God does something wonderful, there are benefits that often affect more than just one person. Think about the great inventors of the past. Morse, Edison, Bell, the Wright brothers. In their day, many ridiculed them as foolish, ridiculous. But they persevered and they triumphed, and many of them saw vindication of their efforts and the confounding of their critics. Winston Churchill became first became Prime Minister of England at age 66. But he had a lifetime and a history of defeat and setback. When he died nearly 25 years later, Millions of people mourned his passing all around the world. Esther had a triumphant testimony. We see Esther's triumphant testimony. It says in verse 4 that the king did hold out that golden scepter, and Esther arose and stood before the king. And then, Esther 7:10, they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's wrath was pacified. It's easy to see that Esther had been blessed by the Lord as early as chapter 2. The story comes to the conclusion finally at the end of the book, and we see, first of all, that the king did invite Esther into his presence and spared her life. Even though, you got to remember, it said, I haven't been called in there for a month. She was the queen. She was chosen as the queen. But ladies, they hadn't had a date for a month. So she wasn't so confident that he'd be happy to see her. But he was. He invited her into his presence. God turned his heart. And then we see Esther asking the king to reverse all that Haman had done. And God moved the king to tell Esther in verse 7 that he had given Esther the house of Haman, had Haman hanged. And it was Haman's hanging that pacified the king's wrath. Not only did he invite her into his presence, but he was angered by all that Haman had conspired to do. And God turned the heart of the king. We see a triumphant testimony in Esther's case. She was faithful to do what God called her to do. She was courageous enough to speak when God called her to speak, and God used her. We see Mordecai as well. Verse 2, the king took off his ring, chapter 8, which he had taken from Haman and gave it unto Mordecai, and Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So this is kind of ironic turn of events at the end of the story here. Here the person that Haman despised, the person that that Haman so desperately wanted to bow down and worship him, the whole reason for Haman's plot, gets Haman's house. He's given all of Haman's possessions, all of his prominence, all of his authority, given to Mordecai. Esther 8, verse 15, Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. So Mordecai came forth triumphant. You know, it's not unusual for people to do the right thing and think that it's, well, you know, that'll never count for anything. Nobody saw that, or that didn't really matter much. And that might have been the case for Mordecai. Remember, he saved the king's life, and the king basically forgot all about it. Nothing ever came of it. But God, later on, 4 chapters later, because the king couldn't sleep one night, basically they read the minutes of all the board meetings there before the king to put him to sleep, right? They had a chronicler that wrote down everything that happened, and the king couldn't sleep. And so he told him, read me back everything that's happened in the past month or so. And it just reminded the king, oh yeah, somebody saved my life. Mordecai, his actions were reminded, the king was reminded of his actions, and he was blessed later on. Christians have to realize God's blessings only come when God decides the time is right. Sometimes it happens right away. Sometimes you wait a long period of time. Sometimes you wait till eternity to see the rewards of your efforts. But God is just, and he promises blessings in exchange for obedience. And after the Jews have been saved, we see that Mordecai is rewarded by the king with this apparel, blue and white, fine linen, crown of gold. He was placed in a prominent position. And in the final chapter of the book, the Bible says that the king advanced Mordecai and allowed him to have more power and might. And the final verse of the book says that Mordecai was made the second most powerful man in the kingdom, and he was allowed to watch over his people. Basically, Mordecai is elevated like Joseph was as a result of Esther's faithfulness and his mentorship. So we see Mordecai's triumphant testimony, Esther's triumphant testimony, and then the people as well in chapter 8, verses 16 through 17. It says, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. The Bible says that Instead of having this uncertain future, instead of being worried for their lives, the Jews, they had a good day. They had light, they had honor, they had joy, they celebrated. And it goes on to say that many people were converted to Judaism because they saw what God had done for his people. Now, what a tremendous testimony for us that God, working through Esther and working through Mordecai and through the testimony of the Jews, brought many people in the kingdom to the one true God. This was a pagan nation, and God showed himself to these people. You know, God should see or be able to show himself in our lives to other people as well. Do people in our jobs, in our families, in our communities, do they see God working in us and through us so that they know, hey, the God that those people serve, he's real, and I want him too. You know, Esther is a great example of faithfulness. She endured some tough times. Her future was uncertain. She had an unapproachable king to deal with. She couldn't write her representative or anything like that. But she endured those tough times. She was gracious in her personal life. She was tender. She showed caring. And in the end, she had a triumphant testimony. Whatever life might bring, we also should be faithful. We should be compassionate with people. And we can also have triumphant testimonies if we just do what God has told us to do in the place where God has put us. Maybe God called you to where you are for such a time as this. You never know. All right, I have several updates for you prayer-wise. So get out your prayer sheets. And those of you that are normally in Awana, this is a great opportunity for you to update some of the people that are on the list because of you. Excuse me. Pray for George Timmer. So he went in to have a procedure done to check on his lung, some tests done, and while they were doing that procedure, they nicked his lung and it collapsed. So they have put a tube in his lung to deal with that. They're hoping to take that tube out tomorrow, and they're going to put him on some steroids for a few days. And so just be praying for George. He's in a lot of pain. He's uncomfortable. This is just another setback for him, and it's been a series of setbacks for him lately. So just be praying for George Timmer. He's downtown in the hospital right now with a collapsed lung. So be praying for him. Be praying for, remember Mary Lou Mulder? Kevin, I'm pretty sure, was laid to rest today. So they had the funeral, but today they went out to the cemetery and did that. So just be praying for Mary Lou. It's been tough for her and the family. It was all very unexpected. And the plan is for her to move out with her daughter in California. So you can be praying about that situation as well. Gina wanted me to put Norm on the list. He's got a health condition he was diagnosed with. Since she's not here, I can't give you the full details of that, but just be praying for him that they can deal with that and treat that and help him with that. So Norm's on our health list now. Bob and Judy Bacchius kind of need to be on the other list now. Bob's had some health issues, and he was in the hospital for a while, and then he came home, and when he came home, he fell down and knocked Judy down, and it caused her to have double vision, which she still has. That led them to seek something different. So they have found a home that they can go to in Cedar Springs. Is that right? Is it Cedar Springs? The Brook? I'm looking at Paul. I think it was Cedar Springs, yeah. I get Cedar Springs and Cedar Rapids mixed up. So it's one of the Cedars. But anyway, the Brook, and it's an apartment that they can both live in together with some care. So they decided to do that. She doesn't want to move out of their house, but she wants to stay with her husband. So just be praying for her. It's a transition that she didn't expect, but she wants to stay with him. And I told her, well, obviously that's the best. If you can stay together, that's the best thing to do. So just be praying for her and Bob as they make that transition as well. Also be praying for Kara Howe. She's been putting updates about her uncle. Her uncle, I think, it was COVID, wasn't it? Came down with COVID and got really, really bad and passed away this morning. And so she and Jonathan are going up north for the funeral, which is on Saturday. And you can be praying also for her aunt during this time too. So, and then, yeah, that's all the ones I have written down to mention tonight. Anything I need to update on our list tonight or add? Neil and Joy are missionaries over in the Philippines. Be praying for them. I'll be praying for Betty Tusink and John Tusink. They have to arrange a trip back centered around a procedure that she's going to have to remove some cancer that they found, and so pray for that. We were able to cut a check to provide for their plane tickets, so when they get a date, they can just buy the tickets. So because of the missions fund, we were able to do that. But I told him to make sure to keep us in the loop if there's any other needs that arise. But there's a lot of details that come with a last-minute trip like that, so especially with coming from Togo all the way back to the States. So just be praying for John and Betty. Not what they expected. They just got back. They just got back to Togo because they were stuck here during all of the lockdowns and all that. So just be praying for them and all that they have to do to get back here, all that they have to get arranged. Be praying for Heidi Foudy. It's our military personnel this week. Carolyn Knickerbocker is our shut-in. She's 100 years old and still sharp as a tack. So, yeah. Yeah, she's a real fun one to visit. She's sharp. So she's doing well, but pray for her this week. And then pray for our Senator, Debbie Sabinow. There are several things going before the Senate, so pray that she makes the right choices there. Any updates? No? Am I forgetting anybody? No? I think there's a couple cards still on the sunshine table, so if you didn't sign those on Sunday, sign them tonight, because we'll send them out this week. All right? We appreciate everybody being here tonight. You're dismissed to your prayers.